He came prepared with talking points, charts, and a calm voice sharpened for the cameras. Congressman Chip Roy thought he had the perfect ambush, accusing AOC of supporting child labor, Chinese dominance, and a so-called war on American jobs. But what happened next wasn't in his script. In under 10 seconds, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't just answer, she detonated, with receipts, with names, and with a calm fury that made the entire room lean forward. She exposed the loopholes, the corporate connections, the votes no one expected her to remember. And then she dropped the bombshell. A revelation so sharp, even Roy's aides froze. This wasn't just a debate, it was a reckoning. And whether you love or hate her, what AOC did that day made history echo. This dramatized story is a work of political fiction inspired by real public figures and themes. While events and dialogue have been fictionalized for emotional impact, the questions it raises about power, integrity, and truth are entirely real. The hearing room was colder than usual, chilled not by temperature, but by the sterile tension that settled when politics met performance. It was the kind of morning that began with polite greetings but sharp glances, where every paper rustle felt rehearsed, every coffee cup placed just so. The topic of the day was supposed to be dry, procedural, federal land management and resource security, but everyone knew it was going to explode into something else, because Chip Roy had come with something loaded. He adjusted his mic, cleared his throat, not loudly but with the confidence of a man who believed the next 5 minutes would belong to him. He spoke with a tone that feigned curiosity but carried the rhythm of a trap. "Madam Chair," he began smoothly, "just a quick question for my colleague across the aisle." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Every eye in the room turned toward Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The cameras followed. Roy continued, letting the silence stretch like a rope. "If we know that electric vehicles, particularly their batteries, are heavily dependent on cobalt sourced from the Congo, and if we also know, as is now widely reported, that that mining involves child slave labor, why then would someone support policies that mandate increased EV production?" A flicker, a blink, not of confusion, of calculation. AOC didn't shift in her seat, didn't fidget, didn't lean toward her mic. She just paused, and that silence said more than most floor speeches ever could. The room tightened, not physically, but in air and attention. Staffers who had been checking their phones suddenly looked up. One aide in the far corner clicked her pen twice and then froze, forgetting why. On the live stream, comment sections ignited, some applauding Roy's boldness, others typing, "Wait for it." It wasn't just the question, it was the way he framed it. Morality as a weapon, concern as camouflage, and a setup designed not for answers, but for ammunition. But the silence after Roy's question wasn't a stumble. It was the moment before a lever is pulled, a breath before a floodgate. AOC tapped her index finger once against her legal pad. No scribbles, just one soft sound. She then glanced, not at Roy, but past him, as if already imagining the ripple his question had triggered across the country. Because she knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't just about cobalt. It wasn't even just about EVS. This was a test of her composure, her memory, her ability to hold contradictions in public without cracking. And everyone was watching. Not just the people in the hearing room, but workers on lunch breaks, students scrolling TikTok, skeptics, critics, supporters who feared she might finally be cornered. There was a camera, front-facing, red light blinking, that zoomed in just enough to catch her eyes, steady, focused. What no one could see, not yet, was what she was building in her head. Timelines, voting records, lobbying ties, supply chain data, buried memos, and the one fact she was going to land like a hammer. But for now, she said nothing. And in that nothing, Chip Roy smiled. It was the kind of smile that comes too early, because what came next wouldn't just answer his question, it would rearrange the room. And by the time it was over, no one, especially Roy, would dare frame the debate the same way again. Her fingers still rested quietly on the notepad, but her mind had already traveled across oceans. She saw them, not as headlines or footnotes, but as children, boys mostly, some no older than 10, barefoot in deep orange mud, their hands cut raw from scraping cobalt out of rocks with rusted tools. No gloves, no goggles, no voice. Just silence and sweat in a world that only seemed to notice them when it needed a talking point. Their backs bent in the Congo while the lights stayed on in Texas. AOC had read the reports, the real ones, not just the summaries. She remembered one case study where a boy named Moise had been buried alive in a mine collapse. 11 years old. No body ever recovered. And his story, like so many others, wasn't told until someone needed a headline to score political points. Now his pain was being offered as rhetorical currency by a congressman who'd never once voted for sanctions, never once proposed international oversight, never once questioned where the copper in his own phone came from. She breathed through her nose quietly. Then her mind jumped to continents, to China, rows of coal plants belching smoke into skies already thick with dust. Refineries that processed cobalt with speed and scale, with little concern for environmental cost. They didn't just build the factories. They bought the ground beneath them and the air above it. They had long-term leases on the future, while America was still bickering over whose fault the past had been. And then, like a snap, she was in Texas. Not in the hearing room, but standing outside a pristine dealership lot. EVs lined up like promises, shiny, sleek, silent, zero emission, zero guilt. At least on the surface. Salespeople in polo shirts, flags waving, pamphlets boasting lifetime battery warranties. A couple argued in front of a silver SUV. She wanted to do her part for the planet. He worried about charging stations. A salesman promised them both. These things are the future. AOC had nothing against EVs. She supported them, loudly, but not blindly. Not when the future came wrapped in other people's pain. That was the cost no one printed on window stickers. Now back in her seat, she blinked once more. Because Chip Roy had tossed a match into a pile of stories she carried every day. But he didn't come for truth. He came for spectacle. And what he didn't realize was that by invoking child labor in Chinese mining and working-class families, he had cracked open the exact conversation she wanted to have. He just didn't know what she'd prepared for it. And he hadn't asked the real question, not the one that mattered. Not, why do EVs depend on cobalt? But, why does the richest country on Earth still refuse to build supply chains that match its values? Now, as the room waited, as Roy leaned slightly back in his chair, smug, satisfied, she began organizing the next few minutes in her head. Not to win a point, not to go viral, but to make sure no one walked away thinking this was ever a simple choice. Not her, not Roy, and definitely not the kids clawing at rocks half a world away. Madam Chair, AOC said, her tone even, almost gentle. May I respond? Permission was granted without hesitation. All eyes turned, not out of obligation, but curiosity. Something in her voice carried weight before it carried volume. The kind of quiet that draws you in, not because it demands attention, but because it doesn't. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't even look directly at Chip Roy. Instead, she looked past him, toward the panel, toward the press table, toward the record. Let's talk, she began, about who really profits from suffering. The sentence didn't land like a punch. It landed like a bell, sharp, clean, and ringing through every corner of the room. There was no anger in her voice, but there was purpose, and everyone felt it. She continued. We've heard a lot this morning about cobalt, about EVs, about child labor. And yes, those are real, brutal issues. But what I find remarkable, she said, her voice tightening just slightly, is how these concerns only seem to matter to some people when they become politically convenient. A pause, not for effect, but for breath. Then she looked at Roy, not with disdain, not even challenge, but with precision. You say you're concerned about children in the Congo. Then where were your votes to regulate foreign mining firms operating through shell companies on U.S. soil? Where was the outcry when exemptions were carved out for refineries shipping raw materials to China under the guise of domestic development? She leaned in, not dramatically, just enough to make her intent unmistakable. Let's be clear, you don't get to outsource the pain, deregulate the process, and then cry foul when the world notices the consequences. The room had shifted. No longer a hearing, it now felt like a moment. One of those rare instances where words didn't just fill the air, they restructured it. AOC scanned the faces in front of her. Some looked away, a few scribbled, but most just watched. I come from a district where people know what it feels like to be invisible until someone needs your story, she said. And I see the same thing happening now. Children in the Congo don't need to be weaponized in our politics. They need to be protected in our policies. A reporter in the back adjusted his camera. A junior staffer gripped her pen without writing. Even one of the more skeptical committee members stopped checking his phone. AOC's voice dipped into something more personal. When we talk about values, we don't just mean what we oppose. We mean what we build. And if we're serious about building a just energy future, then we need to stop pretending that deregulation equals freedom and that silence equals neutrality. Her closing line wasn't rehearsed. It didn't need to be. The real question isn't whether EVs rely on suffering. It's whether we're willing to break the cycle or just keep pointing fingers while the system rolls on. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. It leaned in. And somewhere, off-screen, a red light blinked quietly as the camera zoomed just a little closer. AOC didn't pause to gather notes. She didn't need to. The facts were already there, layered beneath years of hearings, buried in bill summaries, and dusted across footnotes most people never read. But she had read them. She always did. I want to be very clear, she began, her voice steady. This outrage, this sudden moral panic over where minerals come from, isn't new. It's just newly convenient. The comment landed softly, but the meaning was loud. She flipped a page in her folder, eyes not leaving the mic. Let's talk about H.R. 761 from 2 years ago, the Critical Minerals Act. You, Congressman Roy, voted yes. It fast-tracked permits for domestic mining operations, stripping environmental review requirements and cutting indigenous consultation timelines in half. She looked up, not accusing, just matter of fact. That bill passed the House with almost no mention of labor sourcing, no protections for transparency in supply chains, and no guardrails on foreign ownership. Then she turned a second page, this time reading a line aloud. Section 4.3b. Expedited leasing procedures shall not discriminate based on country of majority shareholder ownership if domiciled in U.S. territory. She let it hang for a moment. This isn't policy language. It's an open door. Another page turned. In 2023, just after that bill passed, a Nevada-based mining company, Great Mountain Resources, acquired federal contracts for lithium and cobalt extraction in Utah. On paper, it looks domestic, but the financials show something else. She raised the paper just high enough for the room to see the logo at the top, a familiar multinational firm based in Shanghai. She didn't need to say the name. They all recognized it. 82% of the parent company's equity is held by state-affiliated investors in China, she said. The refining process, per contract, happens offshore. Roy, your office received the same disclosures mine did. You voted to approve fast-track leasing anyway. She could feel the room shift, not in her favor or against Roy, but in clarity, in recognition, the kind that comes when fog starts to lift. This isn't about stopping China. This isn't about child labor, because if it were, we'd be having a very different conversation about how these companies operate under U.S. flags while funneling materials and profits abroad. She slid one last document into the record. Here's the kicker, she said quietly. The same companies we're giving access to sacred federal land are the ones most aggressively lobbying against battery recycling investment in the U.S. Why? Because recycling closes the loop. And closed loops don't make them money. She looked over at Roy, not with anger, but with a calm sense of indictment. So when you say you're concerned about the morality of supply chains, I ask, were you concerned last spring when you voted against the Battery Circularity Act? Were you concerned when amendments to require labor audits were stripped in committee? There was no need to raise her voice. The weight of contradiction did the work for her. This isn't new to you, Congressman. You've seen these names, you've read these clauses, and when the vote came, you didn't stand up and say, not with child labor, not with Chinese monopoly. You stood up and said, yes. A staffer in the back began typing furiously. A voice recorder clicked on. AOC leaned back slightly, letting her last line land with the clarity it deserved. You can't claim moral outrage now when you've spent years building the road it rides in on. She didn't wait for a rebuttal, because this wasn't a debate, it was a dissection, and she wasn't finished. AOC shifted the folder aside and spoke directly now, without paper, without pause. I want to return to something the congressman said earlier, she began, her voice calm but edged with steel. He painted a vivid picture. Chinese coal plants, Congolese children, electric cars piling up in American lots. But let's ask a different question. Who owns the pipeline between all those things? She let that question linger, not rhetorically, but pointedly, then answered it herself. Right now, dozens of companies are applying for fast-track permits to mine lithium, cobalt, and nickel on U.S. federal land. And when you look deeper, follow the filings, the corporate structures, the international subsidiaries, you'll find something consistent. They may be registered in Nevada or Delaware or Texas, but the refining contracts go almost entirely to Chinese facilities. She looked out across the dais, then leaned slightly forward. Why? Because China invested early. Because they built capacity while we gutted regulation, sold off our smelters, and let foreign firms buy our mines under shell corporations that no one here ever questioned. AOC tapped the name of one such firm on the table, its real ownership buried behind 3 layers of incorporation. This company right here, pushing for access to protected lands in Arizona, has a long-term offtake agreement with a refining plant in Zhejiang province. 70% of the raw cobalt mined here, if approved, would be shipped overseas, refined there, and then re-imported as finished product to American markets. She paused, long enough for the meaning to settle. We are not building independence. We are building dependency with better packaging. And then she delivered the line that would be clipped, quoted, and replayed across every social media platform before the hearing even ended. So, sir, who exactly are we feeding, if not the very system you claim to condemn? There it was, quiet, director, devastating. The room didn't gasp. It simply fell into that kind of attentive silence that says everything important had just been said. AOC leaned back slightly, folding her hands. Let's stop pretending we're shocked by child labor when we've done nothing to disrupt the market incentives that sustain it. Let's stop pretending we're at war with Chinese industry when we've deregulated the front door and handed them the keys. She nodded toward Roy's stack of printed talking points. It's one thing to point out real injustice. It's another to use it as a rhetorical shield while your own votes helped write the rules of the game. Then with that same composed tone, she closed the loop. If you want to break this cycle, then let's talk about investing in refining here. Let's talk about enforcing transparency laws on mineral sourcing. Let's talk about creating real incentives for ethical extraction and recycling. But don't wave the suffering of children in front of this body like it's a moral awakening, when it's really a political convenience. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because when truth is delivered plainly enough, it doesn't shout. It echoes. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was surgical, clean, sharp. The kind that doesn't beg to be broken because everyone inside it is still trying to process what just hit them. Chip Roy sat stiffly, shoulders squared, but no longer confident. His pen, so animated minutes earlier, now lay still across his notes, like even it had nothing left to underline. His jaw moved slightly, not to speak, but to clench. The kind of motion someone makes when they've just realized the ground beneath them wasn't as solid as they thought. Across the committee dais, aides shuffled papers without purpose, a performance of productivity to fill the weighty pause. One flipped to the wrong tab in a binder, then backtracked. Another whispered to a colleague, trying to sound strategic, but their eyes were darting toward the screen of a buzzing phone. The live stream had barely cut to wide angle before the hashtags began. Hashtag Roy exposed, hashtag blood cobalt. Hashtag she brought receipts clips circulated faster than the hearing could proceed. One in particular, just 12 seconds long, captured AOC's calm voice as she asked, "So, sir, who exactly are we feeding, if not the very system you claim to condemn?" No theatrics, no raised voice. But something about the stillness in her delivery made it impossible to look away. It was the kind of moment viewers didn't scroll past. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about clarity. On Capitol Hill, that's rarer than anyone likes to admit. Reporters at the press table were no longer scribbling. They were typing full sentences. One leaned back, whispering to no one in particular. She didn't just refute him, she rearranged the entire premise. And yet, AOC wasn't basking in it. She didn't gesture, didn't grin. Her hands rested loosely on the desk, her eyes scanning the room without seeking acknowledgement. If anything, her expression suggested something closer to resolve than victory. Because this wasn't about one man or one bad faith question. It was about a system that made questions like his not only possible, but normal. And for once, that system had been held up to the light. A few seats down, an older Republican congressman, rarely vocal, mostly skeptical, tilted his head ever so slightly, studying her. No words, just a quiet recognition. This wasn't posturing. This was preparedness, and it cut deeper than any headline. Behind AOC, a junior staffer passed forward a scribbled note. CNN already clipped the moment, trending #1 on Twitter. Roy's office hasn't posted a response. She read it, folded it once, slid it beneath her notebook. It could wait, because for her, this wasn't about trending. It was about telling the truth when it's easier not to. She reached for her water, one sip, then sat back, not relaxed, not triumphant, present. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a place built on noise is speak plainly, and then wait. Let the room sit with it. Let the contradictions reveal themselves. Let the silence do what it was never designed to do. Hold the truth. And in that moment, the camera zoomed just a little closer. Not because someone raised their voice, but because someone finally made it impossible to look away. Chip Roy adjusted the microphone with a touch more force than necessary. He leaned forward, cleared his throat, and looked down at his notes, but didn't read from them. This wasn't going to be about legislation now. It was going to be about feelings. I appreciate the Congresswoman's remarks, he began, voice slow and gravelly. But sometimes we can get so caught up in data and documents, we forget what it's like to live real life. He let that sit like a father scolding a room of scholars for missing the obvious. Last Thursday, he continued, I drove 6 hours, 3 each way, from San Marcos to a small town outside Lubbock. My grandmother was dying. My mom asked me to come. I didn't think twice. He paused, looked around, pressed his palms flat on the table. And let me tell you, I made that trip in my Ford pickup. It's a 2013 model, nothing fancy, but it runs, and it gets me where I need to be. I'm not sure some government-mandated electric vehicle would have done the same, not with the lack of chargers out on Highway 84. Some members nodded quietly. Others looked back at their notes. But Roy saw what he needed, a flicker of sympathy. He leaned in. See, this is what folks in D.C. forget. Out in Texas, out in America, people need trucks that work. People need cars they can afford. Cars that don't require an app or a charging station 3 counties away. He shifted tone, just enough to sound more indignant than nostalgic. And now we're being told we're going to mandate electric vehicles? We're going to tell Americans, working-class Americans, that they don't get to choose? That their 2009 Chevy isn't good enough anymore? That their job at the auto shop, the gas station, the repair bay might not exist in 10 years? He let the words drift higher, catching wind from that well-worn rhetoric of freedom and overreach. Then he brought it home. Let's not pretend this is about justice. These mandates don't fall on Wall Street. They fall on welders, on truck drivers, on the single mom trying to get to work in Waco. And if she can't afford the new EV, guess what? She's the one being punished for it. He looked toward AOC, not with fire, but something closer to rehearsed disappointment. Maybe in the Bronx, there are more options. But out where I live, we don't have subway stops. We have miles. And we measure distance not in blocks, but in hours. It was a clever shift. Take the high ground of emotion. Paint regulation as elitism. Turn systemic transition into personal attack. He'd done it before, but never with this much national attention on the room. And sure, he added, softening his tone again, we all care about doing the right thing. But if the so-called right thing means leaving the plumber behind, or the rancher who needs a truck to haul hay, then maybe we need to rethink what right really looks like. The line landed well, at least with the cameras. It wasn't a policy rebuttal. It was a story, a distraction dressed as sincerity. And he knew it. Roy sat back, hands folded, eyes calm. He'd just drawn a line in the sand, not with legislation, but with sentiment. He couldn't match her data, but he could summon an image, a road, a truck, a grandmother, a dying wish, and hope that was enough to muddy the ground beneath her clarity. AOC didn't interrupt. She let him finish. Let him tell his story. Let the weight of a dying grandmother and a long Texas road settle into the room. She respected that, because grief is real and family is sacred. But when he sat back, satisfied with his emotional framing, she leaned forward with a different kind of story, one less comfortable, one less clean. Congressman, she began, voice soft but steady, we all have grandmothers. The room quieted again, the kind of quiet that knows something true is coming. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture. She just remembered. My abuela lived in the Bronx her whole life. She didn't drive a truck. She didn't need to, but she also didn't have the luxury of clean air. Her hands rested gently on the table as she spoke. She lived 2 blocks from the Cross Bronx Expressway, a concrete river of exhaust, 24 hours a day. No trees, no buffer, just diesel fumes and highway dust seeping through the window panes. She looked out toward no one in particular, not trying to perform, just trying to be heard. By the time she was in her 60s, she had trouble breathing. Doctors called it asthma, but we knew what it really was. It was decades of policy decisions made by people who never had to live next to a freeway. It was fossil fuel infrastructure routed through black and brown neighborhoods because it was easier. She paused just long enough for the truth to sink in. She had a nebulizer next to her bed. I still remember the sound it made at night, like a whisper that never stopped. Her voice didn't crack, but it tightened. She didn't ask for electric vehicles. She asked for air that didn't hurt to breathe. Then she turned her gaze back to Roy. I don't question that your trip to see your grandmother mattered. I believe you. But what I'm asking, what this hearing should be asking, is why some grandmothers get roads while others get smokestacks. A quiet murmur swept through the gallery. Not noise, just a kind of emotional shift. Something that wasn't rebuttal or applause, something closer to reckoning. Texas has space, she continued. My district has density. That means we carry the cost differently. You measure miles, we measure particulates. But both of our grandmothers deserve better. She reached for her water but didn't drink, just held the glass. So when we talk about electric vehicles, it's not about punishing plumbers or ranchers. It's about finally acknowledging that the way we've powered this country, through convenience and combustion, hasn't been fair. Then came the line. Not loud, not sharp, just honest. We all have grandmothers, but not all of them can breathe freely. She placed the glass back down. And if we have the means to change that, if we have the technology, the science, and the responsibility, then maybe the question isn't, can I make it 6 hours in an EV? Maybe it's, can a little girl make it to adulthood without a rescue inhaler? The room didn't move. It listened. Because some truths don't need a fight. They just need to be told by someone who's lived them. She let the room breathe again before speaking. Not to slow things down, but to let the weight of what had been said sink deep. Not just the story of a grandmother and asthma, not just the fumes in the Bronx or the miles across Texas, but something more fundamental, how different lives shape different truths. But the real problem wasn't that America had many truths. The real problem was how easily one truth tried to erase the others. AOC leaned in, not to argue, but to clarify. I want to be careful here, she began, because what we're being sold is a false fight. She paused. No one moved. They want us to think this is about cars versus trucks, rural versus urban, coal versus sunlight. But that's not the real divide. She folded her hands. Her voice didn't rise, but the intensity sharpened. The real divide is between systems that were built to serve the powerful and communities that have paid the price for decades. She glanced around the room, eyes steady. I represent constituents who have lived under those systems, and I know some of you do too. So let's stop pretending this is about tailpipes and tech. It's about who gets left behind when power refuses to change. She looked toward Roy, but her words were for the room. No one here is trying to ban trucks. No one here is trying to punish your drive to see your grandmother. What we are trying to do, what I am asking, is that we finally, honestly confront the cost of inaction. She pulled out a folded paper, an EPA report on respiratory illness and proximity to highways, and laid it down gently. This isn't a culture war. It's a public health crisis. And every time we say later, someone's kid grows up sicker. Someone's neighborhood gets hotter. Someone's future gets priced out of reach. She didn't blink. You say these mandates are elitist, but what's elitist is knowing the system's broken and choosing to keep it that way because it's easier. She didn't need to raise her voice to draw attention, because every word now was a spotlight. We can invest in American battery recycling. We can create ethical mining jobs here, not in the shadows of exploitation overseas. We can build charging stations that reach rural counties and urban corners alike. We can choose that future. Another pause, not for drama, but precision. But instead, we're here defending a status quo that's made too many people too sick, too broke, and too tired to keep waiting. She exhaled, not from exhaustion, but purpose. You say this is a war on job, she said, but that's not true. It's a war on lies. And the line landed, not like a punch, but like a bell. Clear, unavoidable, no spin, no pivot. Just a sentence that refused to be ignored. Because deep down, even the people who'd come to argue against her knew what she said was true. And when truth finally enters the room, not the convenient version, not the softened one, but the whole thing, it doesn't need applause to matter. It just needs to be said out loud. The hearing had stretched long past its expected rhythm, but no one was checking the clock. The tension had shifted, from partisan to personal, from scripted to something far more unpredictable. And when AOC asked to reclaim her time, the chair granted it with a nod that said more than words ever could. She stood, not to tower, not to perform, but to make it clear she wasn't done. Because some arguments need to be dismantled in pieces. And this next one was the most dangerous of all. They say, she began, that we face a simple trade-off. Either we allow destructive mining on sacred land here, or we rely on child labor and environmental collapse abroad. She let the false choice hang in the air, not to mimic it, but to expose it. And that, she continued slowly, is a lie. She stepped slightly forward, not pacing, just anchoring. It's a lie that's been repeated so often that some people in this room have started to believe it. But there's another path, one that doesn't force us to choose between harming our land or harming our conscience. She reached into her folder and pulled out a page. No more than a single sheet, but weighted with facts. This is a report from the Department of Energy, she said, raising it. And here's what it says. With current technology, we can recover up to 95% of the lithium, cobalt, and nickel from spent EV batteries. She placed the page gently on the desk in front of her. Let me say that again. 95%. That means every battery we've already used doesn't have to become waste. It can become supply. A few murmurs stirred, quiet, curious. On the dais, a staffer nudged a colleague and pointed to the report's title, 2024 National Battery Materials Circularity Framework. AOC continued, her voice measured but unmistakable. And yet, she said, despite knowing this, Congress has repeatedly failed to fund large-scale battery recycling infrastructure. We have the science. We have the technology. What we don't have, yet, is the political will. She turned slightly, scanning the room. And the reason is simple. Recycling doesn't make the same people rich. It doesn't justify land grabs. It doesn't invite foreign companies to drill on indigenous land. It doesn't feed the narrative that progress must come at someone else's expense. She let that land before moving on. There are thousands of tons of battery material already circulating in our economy. waiting to be reused. But instead of investing in the systems to recover it, we're debating which sacrifice is more acceptable, our water or someone else's children. Her hands rested lightly on the table. I reject that choice, and I think most Americans would too, if we gave them the full picture instead of political framing. She looked up. We're told the only way forward is more extraction, more mining, more permitting, more deregulation. But when you actually listen to scientists, to engineers, to communities, what they're asking for isn't destruction. It's design, circular design, sustainable systems, jobs that don't poison the land they're built on. And then she closed with a clarity no headline could distort. This is not a question of mine or maim. The real question is, why do we keep pretending there isn't a third option when it's right in front of us, waiting to be funded? The silence that followed wasn't awkward this time. It was thoughtful. The kind that happens when people are no longer arguing the future, but realizing they've underestimated its possibilities. She didn't sit down after the last point. Not yet. There was still one thread left hanging, one truth that needed to be pulled forward so the whole pattern could be seen. We talk a lot in this room about hard choices, AOC said, voice steady. But what never gets talked about is the easy one we keep avoiding. She held up another sheet of paper, this one less glossy, a printed amendment summary. This is the Battery Recycling Innovation and Efficiency Act. It was introduced twice, both times stripped of funding before it even made it to a full vote, and both times blocked by members of this very committee. Her eyes scanned across the faces. Some didn't flinch. Others pretended to study their pens. One stared back, defiant but quiet. It wasn't blocked because it was unworkable. It was blocked because it wasn't profitable, at least not for the people used to making money the old-fashioned way, digging, drilling, and discarding. She tapped the table twice, firmly. The science says we can reuse 60 to 70% of all critical battery materials currently in circulation. That's not theory, that's fact. The Department of Energy, Argonne National Lab, independent researchers all point to the same reality. We can close the loop, we just don't. Her voice didn't rise, it deepened. Instead of investing in regional recycling hubs, especially in rural areas that could benefit most, we pour billions into new mines that will be obsolete the minute we take circularity seriously. Then came the pivot, as sharp as it was personal. I hear a lot about protecting American jobs, but when we had the chance to fund new skilled labor opportunities in battery disassembly, reprocessing, material science, where were the votes? Where was the urgency? A silence, a long one, because everyone knew the answer. It's easy to stir panic about rare earths in Chinese hands. It's harder to explain why we won't build the tools to stop depending on them. She leaned in, not to scold, but to unveil. Because the truth is, battery recycling doesn't get Fox News segments. It doesn't rile up a base. It doesn't scare people. And that, my colleagues, is the problem. Her final line hit not with volume, but with focus. Why invest in solutions when fear is easier to sell? She let it hang, just long enough for it to sting. Fear sells clicks. Fear fills campaign coffers. Fear gets quoted. But solutions? Solutions take work, vision, courage, and those don't always fit into a soundbite. AOC paused for breath, not from exhaustion, but from clarity. We could have created thousands of jobs, reduced global pressure on mining, protected sacred lands, empowered workers in the Midwest and the South with next-generation skills. We could have led, but instead we stalled because fear won. Then gently she placed the amendment summary into the public record. No one voted against this because they didn't believe in recycling. They voted against it because it didn't fit the narrative. She sat back, finally, her work for this round complete. Not triumphant, just honest. And in the stillness that followed, the room understood what had just been laid bare. The biggest obstacle to solving the climate crisis isn't technology. It's the politics of delay. By the time the hearing ended, the most powerful responses weren't coming from the committee room. They were coming from living rooms, classrooms, factory floors. While the headlines tried to summarize what had just happened, real people were already filling in what the coverage missed. In a high school classroom in Minneapolis, a civics teacher paused her lesson on the Constitution. She'd watched the hearing clip over her lunch break, eyes fixed on the moment AOC held up that single page of DOE data and said, "We're not choosing between minds and children. We're choosing between courage and comfort." Now she played the video for her class. The room of juniors and seniors, some half engaged at first, slowly began to sit up straighter. One girl leaned over to whisper, "Wait, we can recycle batteries?" The teacher nodded. "That's what no one talks about," she replied. Until now. In Michigan, a man named Daryl sat in his parked pickup, holding his phone at arm's length. The background showed the entrance of a modest facility behind him, his workplace for the past 7 years, a regional battery recycling plant that had survived 3 rounds of layoffs. "This is the first time I've heard someone in Congress say what we do even exists," he said into the camera. His voice wasn't angry, just tired. "We can strip the cobalt out of old EV batteries. We can do it here. We want to do it. But nobody funds us. Nobody even visits." He paused, then added, "Except her. She gets it." He tagged the clip, #truth or trade-off. Within hours, it had been shared over 100,000 times. In Arizona, a small indigenous rights coalition released a statement on social media, quoting AOC's words verbatim, "Recycling doesn't justify land grabs." Underneath it, they posted side-by-side images, one of a proposed cobalt mine near sacred ceremonial grounds, the other of a regional report showing the same mineral could be reclaimed from retired batteries. In Ohio, a local paper ran a headline that read, "She didn't yell. She just proved everyone else wrong." And in California, a group of graduate students in environmental engineering launched a campaign overnight. The page was simple, a link to AOC's remarks, a petition demanding congressional funding for regional battery recovery centers, a counter-tallying signatures. Within a day, it passed 30,000. Not all the reactions were supportive, of course. Talk radio spun it as greenwashing with graphs. One headline claimed she wanted to ban new mining altogether. She hadn't. But the energy was different this time. Something in the way she laid it out, fact by fact, truth by truth, had made the argument harder to twist. And for the first time in a long time, a conversation that usually happened behind paywalls or buried in technical PDFs was playing out in real time, among people who'd been told for years that the transition to clean energy was a battle they had no part in. Now they saw it differently. Now they saw a choice. And across social platforms, in offices and break rooms, a question began to rise. If we already have the tools to build a just transition, why are we still pretending we don't? No one had the full answer, but thanks to her, they were finally asking the right question. There was a rhythm to hearings like this, a choreography, members speaking, staffers scribbling, cameras panning, and then, tucked just behind the last row of official seating, always there, rarely noticed, sat the quietest power in the room. They weren't elected. They didn't wear pins, but their suits were sharper, their notebooks cleaner, and their eyes trained not on the speakers, but on the subtext. Lobbyists, veterans of the slow war of influence. They knew how to wait. AOC didn't call them out right away. She let them sit, let them watch, let them believe they were still invisible. Then she turned. She didn't point. She didn't need to. Her gaze swept the back row, steady, knowing. "Some of you know exactly who I'm looking at," she said. A ripple moved, not across the members' table, but in the gallery. One man uncrossed his legs. Another adjusted his tie without thinking. The woman on the aisle stopped mid-scroll on her phone. "This debate," AOC continued, "is not about batteries. Not really. It's about control." Her voice didn't spike. But something in the room shifted. A recalibration. A quiet reordering of who, exactly, was being addressed now. It's about who gets to decide what American-made means. Who gets to shape the rules on refining, on supply chains, on who profits while others pay. She flipped a page and held it at chest level. The room couldn't see it, but the names were there, and she read them slowly, deliberately. Americans for Energy Access, Responsible Mining Council, the Clean Tech Freedom Initiative. She let each one breathe before adding, all of them registered lobbying entities, All of them actively opposed labor disclosures in mineral sourcing. All of them lobbied to kill regulatory language that would have required transparency in Chinese-affiliated refining partnerships. Another pause, no one moved. These groups, many of whom are represented in this room, don't show up to protect American families. They show up to protect margins, to keep loopholes open, to make sure the cobalt pipeline stays opaque enough to exploit. She set the document down. And then they turn around and hand talking points to members of Congress who stand here and say they're worried about child labor. She didn't say Roy's name. She didn't have to. The trail was clear. This isn't a battle over the environment. It's a battle over whose truth gets funded. Her hands rested calmly on the table. We could have passed mandatory third-party audits on foreign mineral sourcing. We could have created a registry of ownership for U.S. mining leases. We could have required that any company drilling on public land disclose its entire chain of custody, from pit to port. She leaned slightly forward. But every time one of those measures was introduced, guess who came knocking? No answer. Just silence. And every time, just before the vote, those same groups sent emails, scheduled dinners, offered alternative language that wouldn't disrupt the market. And then the reforms disappeared. She folded her hands again. So let's stop pretending this is about saving anyone. It's about preserving a status quo that's been sanitized, repackaged, and sold as patriotic. And it's not. One of the lobbyists shifted his weight in the chair. Another picked up her coat. Too early to leave, but just early enough to want to. AOC stayed still. You don't need to name the power in the room to challenge it, she said. You just need to stop pretending it isn't sitting right behind you. The lobbyists in the back row still hadn't moved. Some had dropped their gaze. Others clung to stillness as a kind of camouflage. But AOC wasn't speaking to them anymore. Not directly. Her words now aimed higher and deeper. Let's talk about mandates, she said, turning back toward the dais. Because we keep hearing that electric vehicle targets are some sort of overreach, that they're forcing change on people who didn't ask for it. But let's be honest. That's not the real mandate we're living under. She paused, letting the weight settle before delivering the line. The real mandate is silence, and the real cost is integrity. There it was, clean, unapologetic, the kind of truth that cuts quietly but doesn't fade. She looked across the room, not for effect, but for accountability. For decades, the quiet agreement in this town has been this. Let industry write the rules, and we'll all pretend it's freedom. Let the exemptions pile up, and we'll call it flexibility. Let the damage fall on someone else, somewhere else, and we'll call that balance. She pulled out a printed spreadsheet, columns of exemptions, carve-outs, and waivers related to critical mineral sourcing. It wasn't flashy, but it was damning. This list shows over 40 corporate exemptions granted in the last 3 years, most of them buried in rider amendments or hidden in language no one reads. Exemptions for environmental reporting, for sourcing disclosures, for ownership transparency. She held it up, then dropped it onto the table with a soft slap that still echoed. Where was the outrage then? Where were the floor speeches about accountability, about ethics? Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. We are so quick to condemn regulation that protects people, but we whisper when regulation is gutted to protect profit. She looked toward the camera now, toward the public. And the question we have to ask is this. Why do so many of these exemptions exist in plain sight? Who benefits from making silence seem like neutrality? From making complexity seem like inevitability? Then came the pivot, sharp but honest. I've been told that fighting for EV standards is extreme, but I'd argue that not fighting for transparency is far more dangerous. Because once you normalize silence, you don't just lose oversight, you lose your compass. She let the silence return for a beat. People in this country are being told they have to choose between a clean future and a functional one, between jobs and justice. But those choices aren't real. They're manufactured. And the manufacturers don't live in my district or yours. A glance back at the lobbyists. One had quietly slipped out. Another was pretending to check their phone. AOC turned back to the mic. The next time someone warns you about mandates, ask them what the current mandate is. Ask them who it's protecting. Ask them why the same voices yelling about overregulation never seem to speak up when billion-dollar companies get a free pass. She rested her palms on the table. Because if silence is the rule and profit is the exception, then maybe the real overreach is pretending we haven't already been bought. For a moment, no one said anything. The hearing room wasn't silent in the way it had been earlier. Not stunned, not tense, but hushed with the kind of stillness that follows clarity. It wasn't victory, and it wasn't defeat. It was what happened when someone finally said what most people weren't supposed to say out loud. Then a sound broke through. Quiet, controlled. One clap, sharp, deliberate, from a staffer seated in the corner. Then another, this time from across the aisle. Not a standing ovation, not theater, but the kind of response that said, "We heard you." A few more joined in, soft, careful but real. One member leaned into his microphone, then pulled back, deciding better of it. Another, a Republican from a swing district who rarely spoke at hearings unless cornered by cameras, sat back in his chair with a look that didn't quite register as agreement, but wasn't resistance either. He exhaled slowly, the corners of his mouth pressed together, not in frustration, but in thought. AOC didn't react to the clapping. She didn't acknowledge it with a nod or a wave or any sign that it mattered to her more than the record. Because for her, it was never about the moment. It was about the message. She gathered her notes quietly, organizing them into her folder with the same care she had used when preparing them. One page slid into the pocket out of order. She fixed it. Small movements, unhurried. A calmness that came not from the absence of pressure, but from walking through it and coming out clear on the other side. As she stood, reporters near the back began to shift. One reached for a mic. Another was already on their phone, sending the alert before the door even opened. AOC ends testimony with scorching critique of lobby influence and the mandate of silence. The chairwoman gave a subtle nod as AOC stepped back. No fanfare, just mutual respect. That was more than enough. And then the wave began. Not applause, not cheers. Press cameras lifted, notebooks opened. A hallway that had been mostly still now turned kinetic. She stepped through the door, and within seconds the press pool caught up. "Congresswoman, do you believe this hearing changed anything? Do you plan to introduce a new battery recycling amendment? Do you think Roy's silence today says more than his questions did yesterday?" She didn't answer right away. She kept walking, steady, unbothered, focused. At the end of the hallway, one journalist called out above the rest, "What would you say to Americans who feel like this debate has nothing to do with them?" AOC stopped. She didn't turn fully, just enough. And with that same calm voice she'd carried through the entire hearing, she replied, "If you breathe, if you work, if you love someone who lives near a freeway or works in a factory, this debate is about you, and it always has been." Then she kept walking. Behind her, reporters followed. Behind them, clips were already being edited. And across the country, 1,000 quiet conversations were starting in kitchens, classrooms, comment sections. Whispers turning into questions. Questions turning into clarity. And clarity, as always, turning into movement. The studio lights were colder than the hearing room, but they had the same intention. Expose everything. The host sat across from her with practiced poise, chin tilted just enough to appear thoughtful, eyebrows arched in permanent curiosity. The lower third banner read, "Cobalt, Climate, and Congresswoman Cortez. What's the real cost of clean?" AOC sat calmly in a navy blue jacket. No frills, no slogans. Just the folder she always carried, now closed. She didn't need notes this time. "Congresswoman," the host began, leaning in, "you've been applauded for your testimony this week, especially your remarks on battery recycling. But critics say your proposals would cost taxpayers billions and delay EV development for years. What do you say to that?" She didn't blink, didn't rush. "I say that if we don't build ethical supply chains now, we inherit broken ones later." The host hesitated. That wasn't the soundbite he was hoping for. Too composed, too complete. "But respectfully," he pressed, "isn't that idealistic? We're in a geopolitical arms race for minerals. Isn't it a little naive to slow down progress while we figure out the perfect system? AOC tilted her head slightly, not dismissively but with clarity. First, I'm not calling for perfection. I'm calling for integrity, she said. If we define progress as speed without scrutiny, then we've already lost. She kept her gaze steady. We don't need a perfect system to build a better one, but we do need to stop outsourcing our conscience just because it's convenient. The host tried again, this time a little sharper. Let's be honest, Congresswoman. Some Americans watching this might say, I can't afford to care where my battery comes from. I just need a car that works. Isn't this a luxury conversation? AOC nodded slowly, thoughtfully. I've lived paycheck to paycheck. I know what it feels like to choose between principles and survival. But here's the thing. Working people aren't the ones designing broken systems. They're the ones forced to live within them. She leaned forward slightly now, bridging the space between talking point and truth. This isn't a luxury conversation. It's a responsibility conversation. And responsibility doesn't belong to the consumer. It belongs to those of us in power. The host glanced down at his notes, perhaps looking for a pivot. She waited. I want to be clear, she continued. I support EV adoption. I support innovation. What I don't support is telling the American people they must pick between environmental justice and economic survival. Because that's a false choice, manufactured by the very industries that benefit when we don't ask questions. The camera shifted angles, but she didn't. Battery recycling is not a delay, it's an investment. Ethical sourcing is not a burden, it's a safeguard. And transparency is not a threat, it's the first step to building trust. The host sat back for a beat, trying to reframe. So what happens if your plan doesn't pass? If the loopholes stay open? AOC smiled, soft but unshaken. Then we'll keep talking, keep organizing, keep showing up. Because eventually the cost of ignoring this won't just be moral, it'll be economic, it'll be political, and it'll be impossible to spin. He blinked. Final word. She didn't hesitate. If we don't build ethical chains now, she said again, slower this time, we inherit broken ones later. The segment ended, but the clip didn't. By noon it was trending. Again. And in the comment sections, something different was happening. Not outrage, not echo chambers. Just questions. The kind that don't go away when the lights fade. It started with sidewalk chalk. In the South Bronx, outside a modest congressional field office on 138th Street, a group of teenagers, climate club members from a local public high school, gathered on a Saturday afternoon with nothing but homemade signs, QR codes, and chalk in bright neon colors. They wrote phrases across the pavement. Not a luxury, a responsibility. Recycling is resistance. And in big curved block letters, hashtag truth or trade off. They weren't blocking traffic. They weren't holding microphones, just holding space. One student had printed out AOC's quote from her TV appearance and taped it to the window. We don't need a perfect system, we need an honest one. People walking by slowed down. Some nodded. A woman paused with a toddler on her hip and whispered, "Thank you." A delivery worker took a photo before riding off. They weren't looking for attention, but it found them anyway. That same weekend, nearly 4,000 miles away, a different kind of conversation was taking shape. In a town hall meeting near Fairbanks, Alaska, a group of local residents, miners, teachers, native leaders, small business owners, sat in a circle, debating a proposal that had divided their community, a new cobalt mining project on nearby federal land. The company was promising jobs, but locals had read the fine print, and they didn't like what they saw. Foreign refining contracts, water use waivers, vague labor practices. The meeting ended without consensus, but what followed surprised everyone. The next morning, a letter appeared in AOC's office inbox. It was signed by 27 Alaskans across generations and political parties. It read in part, "We support ethical mining here, if it's truly American-owned and regulated. We're tired of being told we have to accept shortcuts just to be part of the solution. Please keep speaking up. We hear you up here too." She printed the letter and pinned it on her office wall, not as proof of approval, but as a reminder. Integrity doesn't require unanimity, just enough people willing to say, "Not like this." In the days that followed, smaller moments flickered across the map. In New Mexico, a student newspaper published an op-ed. Don't pit the climate against the working class, rebuild both. In Georgia, a battery recycling technician posted a TikTok with one line, "We exist, and we're ready to scale." In Wisconsin, a conservative-leaning radio caller surprised the host by saying, "I don't always agree with AOC, but she's right. If we don't build this here, we'll be buying it from the same folks we claim to oppose." It wasn't a wave, it wasn't a movement, but it was something rarer, cross lines of thought beginning to meet. Because when people in the Bronx and people in Alaska start asking the same questions, not just about policy, but about fairness, ownership, and whose voice counts, something is shifting. And that's how real change starts in America. Not always loud, not always fast, but from far apart corners, learning to speak a shared language, not of party, but of principle. 3 days after the hearing, Chip Roy re-entered the conversation, not from the House floor, but from the opinion pages. A column appeared under his name in a national conservative outlet titled, "We don't need lectures. We need real energy solutions." The timing was deliberate, the framing familiar. He opened with his grandmother again, then quickly pivoted to the heart of his argument, that the left was out of touch, obsessed with moral purity while working Americans struggled to fuel their trucks, heat their homes, and keep their jobs. He accused AOC of playing politics with pain, of offering sound bites, not strategy. But the moment had already moved. The piece was shared, yes, retweeted by allies, picked up by talk radio, circulated in inboxes that wanted affirmation. But it didn't land like he expected. The audience had changed. The questions had changed. And this time, the silence after his column wasn't deference. It was disinterest. By noon, the top comment under the post read, "You lost the argument when she brought the receipts." It wasn't hostile. It wasn't even particularly partisan. It was matter of fact. That's what unsettled his team the most. Another comment followed, "She didn't accuse. She proved. That's the difference." Others chimed in from unexpected corners. A retired geologist wrote, "I don't agree with AOC on everything, but she's the first person I've seen name the actual supply chain players by name. That matters." Roy's office issued a follow-up statement trying to clarify his position, emphasizing his support for American energy independence. But the moment to control the narrative had already slipped. The old formula, emotion, division, flag-waving generalities, wasn't sticking the way it used to. Because people had watched the hearing. They'd seen the spreadsheets, the quotes, the lobbyist names. They'd heard the quiet fury in AOC's voice when she said, "You can't outsource the pain, deregulate the process, and then cry foul when the world notices the consequences." What Roy didn't realize, perhaps, was that the battle had already shifted. It wasn't about who sounded tougher on TV. It was about who sounded honest in the room. Even his usual base wasn't fully on script. In a Texas town hall later that week, a voter asked him, not confrontationally but plainly, "What about that battery recycling bill? Why'd y'all kill it?" He stumbled, offered a vague answer about cost and feasibility, but it didn't land. Because now the people asking questions weren't activists. They were his own constituents, curious, calm, and less willing to settle for slogans. Somewhere along the way, the tone had shifted, not because someone shouted louder, but because someone had walked in with facts, told a human truth, and refused to let cynicism drown it out. That was AOC's power, not performance, but precision. Not just rebuttal, but redirection. And now Roy's voice, once so practiced at shaping the story, was starting to feel like it was speaking into a room that had already turned the page. The murals on the school's front wall were still faded from last winter's storms. Chipped edges, sun-bleached names of alumni who once dreamed in those classrooms. But the spirit inside hadn't dimmed. Not here, not in the Bronx. AOC stepped into PS 96 just before second period. No cameras, no podium. Just a borrowed visitor badge and a coffee she barely had time to finish. Her team had suggested skipping the visit. There were still interviews, briefings, news cycles swirling from the hearing. But she'd insisted. "This," she said, "is the whole point." Inside, the auditorium buzzed with the kind of energy only eighth graders could generate, half anxious, half unimpressed. Some whispered her name. Others looked at their phones. One kid in the front row wore a shirt that read, "Change the code, not the climate." She smiled. A teacher introduced her. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, representing New York's 14th district, and a former student, just like you. Applause followed, but it wasn't thunderous. It was respectful, curious. They didn't cheer just because they were told to. They wanted to hear her for themselves. She didn't start with politics. She started with asthma. "Do you know," she said, "how many kids in this zip code have breathing problems from pollution? 1 in 4. That's not normal, but they'll tell you it is." She told them about walking to school past idling trucks, about her abuela's inhaler, about how people learn to accept harm when it's wrapped in routine. Then she opened the floor. A boy in the back asked, "Do you actually think Congress listens to you?" She nodded. "Not always, but I speak so they can't pretend they didn't hear." Laughter, not mockery, recognition. Then a girl near the aisle raised her hand. 14, maybe 15, black sweatshirt, quiet eyes. "Do you think," she asked slowly, "the world can actually change?" The room stilled. AOC didn't answer right away. She walked off the stage, crouched beside the girl's seat, looked her in the eye. "I think the world does change," she said, "but only when people like you stop waiting for permission." A few students leaned forward. Others looked down, as if holding something heavy inside. She continued, "Grown-ups will always say, 'Not now, not like that, not you.'" But history didn't wait for anyone polite. It moved because someone young stood up and said, "This isn't working." The girl nodded, just once. But that was enough. Afterward, in the hallway, a teacher whispered, "That question? That girl hasn't spoken in weeks." By the time she reached the exit, more students had gathered near the double doors. Some asked for selfies. One handed her a folded note. It read, "My brother works in battery recycling." He said thanks. Outside, her staff waited in the car, engine running. Rain misted the sidewalk. Sirens somewhere in the distance. She paused before stepping in, looked back at the school building, its bricks worn, its windows glowing faintly from fluorescent light. And she smiled, because for all the hearings, all the headlines, all the hashtags, this was what mattered. Not the last word, but the first spark. And in that auditorium, among chipped paint and restless questions, something had been lit. The Capitol felt different that week. Not louder, not more chaotic, just charged. A shift in the current, subtle but real, like when wind changes direction before a storm. Conversations that once ended in shrugs now lingered in hallways. People who rarely crossed the aisle had begun trading notes. And somewhere between a closed-door budget session and a transportation committee lunch, it happened. A draft bill began circulating, quietly, then with momentum. The Critical Materials Reuse Act wasn't flashy. No primetime rollout, no grand ceremony, but its proposal was sharp. Federal investment in EV battery recycling infrastructure, subsidies for startups using U.S. recovered cobalt and lithium, and strict transparency on mineral sourcing. Most surprisingly, it was bipartisan. Senator Welch from Vermont attached a co-sponsorship, then a moderate Republican from Nevada, then another from Michigan citing economic resiliency. The language was careful, almost allergic to ideology, but the intent was clear. America would stop throwing away the future to chase the past. In a procedural hearing the next morning, Representative Tompkins, an older Democrat with a reputation for pragmatism, took the floor. "I want to quote something that stayed with me," he said, adjusting his glasses. "A colleague of mine said this: 'They say we must choose between harming sacred lands here or children abroad. That is a lie.'" Murmurs. Some glanced around, already recognizing the words. "She said it last week. I think we all remember." No name was mentioned. It didn't have to be. The quote had lived on, not in the media, but in the memo pads of staffers, in classroom walls, on protest signs, and now in the congressional record. Across the country, the reaction was uneven but undeniable. Local news anchors covered the bill with cautious optimism. Rare bipartisanship on climate. Industry groups released mixed statements, supportive in tone, but bristling at the oversight mechanisms. The fossil lobby notably stayed silent. Meanwhile, on social media, the momentum surged. Clips from the hearing resurfaced, spliced with interviews from miners in Nevada and Bronx students watching the debate unfold. The hashtag #BuiltNotBought trended. One widely shared TikTok showed a side-by-side. Roy's quote about visiting his grandmother and how EVs wouldn't make it. AOC's response: "We all have grandmothers, but not all of them can breathe freely." The contrast hit differently now. What once felt like a skirmish of sound bites had become a battle over substance. And yet, in major publications, her name was often missing. "Congress moves on EV battery funding," read one headline. "Lawmakers reach rare agreement on critical minerals," read another. No mention of who reframed the issue, who brought the receipts, who stared down lobbyists in the back row and asked why children were dying for our phones. AOC didn't respond with frustration. When a reporter asked her in the hallway how it felt to be excluded from credit, she shrugged, unscripted. "If the planet gets better, I don't care who signs the bill." Still, her words lived on. That same day, a House intern from Arkansas tweeted a photo of her yellow notepad, scrawled at the top in pen, "This isn't a war on jobs. It's a war on lies." It got 84,000 likes in 3 hours. Back in her district, her office phone rang more than usual, not with outrage or urgent requests, but with thank yous. One came from a retired engineer in Arizona. "I thought I was too old to see change. You made me believe again." Another from a woman in Kentucky. "My son thought politics was fake until he saw you speak. Now he's researching lithium recovery. Sometimes change is loud, but sometimes it spreads like roots under the surface. Quiet, persistent, undeniable." The bill would still face negotiation. Funding levels would be fought over. Loopholes would be lobbied for. But something had shifted, not just in legislation, in expectation, in belief, in what Congress could still be when truth, spoken calmly, backed with clarity and rooted in justice, found the courage to hold the floor. The Capitol lights had started to dim, as they always did near closing hours, softening the sharp marble edges into something gentler, almost intimate. In the hush that followed a long week of hearings, speeches, pushbacks, and passed amendments, AOC walked the corridor, folder tucked under one arm, heels echoing not with ceremony, but with quiet insistence. Her voice came not from a podium now, but from narration. Words that had lived in her notes, her lungs, her bones, now spoken plainly for a late-night interview, taped for public radio, airing to anyone still listening. "They say progress is impossible without pain," she began, voice steady, measured, not defiant, not weary, just real. "I say it's impossible without truth." Her footsteps continued down the hallway. A janitor mopping the far end of the corridor looked up briefly, didn't stop working, but nodded once. "We don't power the future with lies," she continued, "or coal or cobalt dug from children's hands. We don't fuel justice with silence, or with the comfort of pretending the cost of convenience is invisible." Each word landed like a drop of water on stone. Not flashy, but unignorable. We power it with courage and clarity and the will to keep showing up. Outside it was raining. Not a storm, just a steady mist, the kind that clung to the skin and made you notice the air you walked through. Inside, AOC passed a staffer from another office. He paused, then, without speaking, adjusted the folders in his arms and fell in step behind her. Moments later, a young intern, just past 18, clutching a stack of printed transcripts, glanced up from her phone and followed too. She didn't know where the congresswoman was going, but somehow it felt right to walk. Back in the recording booth, the interviewer had asked AOC why she kept pushing when so many doors were closed. She'd smiled, not out of irony, but something softer. "Because I wasn't elected to whisper. I was elected to witness. And there's a difference." Now in the silence of the corridor, that difference rang out. As she walked, she passed framed portraits of lawmakers past, some forgotten, some lionized. all silent. AOC's narration continued. There are two choices in politics: protect power or protect people. Sometimes we confuse the two. We mistake applause for action. We mistake headlines for justice. But those things fade. What stays are the people who got up when it wasn't easy, who told the truth when it wasn't safe, who asked the right question even when no one wanted to answer. By the time she reached the rotunda, the group behind her had grown. Not a crowd, not a rally, just a few more people who didn't want to walk alone. A legislative assistant, a janitor off shift, a journalist intern still wearing her press badge. None of them said a word. They just walked. Outside the Capitol, the rain kept falling. Washington blinked in the wet night, as if pausing between one chapter and the next. And still her voice went on. They tell us to wait, for the right time, for the right tone, for the perfect policy. But justice isn't a train you catch when it's convenient. It's a path you carve when the road disappears. The final image, the back of her figure in motion, not triumphant, not spotlighted, just moving forward. One pair of steps, then another, then another. The screen fades, not to black, but to the glow of hallway lights reflected on polished stone. And as her voice delivers its final line, it's not a declaration. It's a reminder, a whisper turned chorus, a seed turned signal. You don't need to be loud to lead, she says. You just need to walk first. This story reminds us that real change doesn't always come from headlines or applause. It often begins with one person refusing to accept silence as the price of truth. AOC didn't just challenge policy, she challenged the way we think about responsibility. Her voice echoed because it wasn't just hers. It carried the weight of workers, elders, children, and anyone who's been told their fight is too small. It's a reminder that dignity and justice don't shout. They show up and stand firm. Question for you. Have you ever witnessed someone quietly shift the direction of a conversation, not with power, but with purpose? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.